Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our very special Israel Bonds and British Israel Chamber of Commerce event about climate change. In a small amendment to our advertised schedule, Professor Rick Williams of Liverpool University will also be joined by Professor Colin Price of Tel Aviv University, who will also be able to let us know a little bit about what they've been doing in Israel and how climate change could affect them there. Before we start the proceedings, I want to give you a quick run through of how the event will work today. After the presentations, we will have a quick Q&A session. If you want to ask any questions, we encourage you to have your cameras on. All you have to do to be called on is to raise your hand using the raise hand button. I'm sure that we're all familiar with these days, but for those of you who don't know where it is, you just need to bring up the participants list, and it's right there at the bottom of that list. We will send you an unmute request, so just accept it and ask away. You can ask either professor or both, so don't be shy. This is a very unique opportunity. Israel Bonds is dedicated to being in our communities across the UK. We have coming up in the next few days a brand new, very exciting online purchasing capability where you'll be able to buy bonds from just £36. And we would be very happy if you would want to buy a bond as a gift for someone else, or better yet, as a donation to an organisation such as the BICC, Liverpool University, or of course, Tel Aviv University Trust. We're of course on hand in order to help in any way you might need. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. Brian White, Chairman of the BICC, to introduce our main speaker.
Thank you very much, Joe. I assume I'm not muted. I think you put everybody on mute, but
you're not.
People can hear me. Thank you. Just thought I'd check before I launched and find that nobody could hear me for 5 minutes. Thank you. First of all, a few words about the Chamber. What has the Chamber been doing in these difficult and complex times, COVID? We've been making a lot of connections, a lot of networking between Israeli and British companies successfully, all under the clever guidance and unbelievable guidance of Gideon Klaus, who on the 14th of October, in about 3 weeks' time, will have been with the Chamber for 27 years. That in itself is a tremendous achievement. I really want to put on record and formally record the unbelievable work and dedication and professionalism that Gideon has put in and continues to put in, even in the semi-final years of his life, as he likes to call it. Now he's a little bit over 80, but I love the term semi-finals, Gideon. And just to give you a little flavor of some of the examples of what we've been doing, matching Israeli and UK companies for counterparts in the areas of keeping crowds safe, traffic management, in the areas of security equipment, in the areas of care for elderly people, all things were impacted by the current lifestyles that we live in. And those UK and Israeli partnerships continue to be made on a day-to-day basis. We continue to make connections. We work closely with the embassy, and Gideon is doing a sterling job. For those of you who are not members, please join us. That is our lifeblood. So that's about the work of the Chamber, and we do hope to get back to meeting people in person as soon as we can and as soon as the rules allow us to do that. Let me now I have the pleasure and honour of introducing Professor Rick Williams, who is formal title is Professor of Earth, Ocean and Ecological Sciences, which is a pretty fundamental and pretty impressive title. As you would expect, the entire gamut of every professional qualification I've ever seen, BSc, MSc, PhD and professorship. And that makes him extremely qualified to speak on the subject of climate change and what's happening, particularly with the focus on the oceans. And I think you could not say anything was more apposite, given what's happened recently with the hurricanes in America, the fires in other countries. And if anybody had any doubt that climate change is on top of us and we need to do something towards getting to a net zero carbon output, this is the clear strategy. And without further ado, let me hand over to Professor Rick Williams to walk us through those thoughts.
Thanks very much, Brian. I'll just share my screen now. Okay, thank you very much, Brian, for that introduction, and thank you all for the invitation. I'm very much a climate scientist, and I'll partly talk about that. But to make this accessible, I'm very much going to draw upon videos to make the science a little bit more accessible. But then I'll move on to something that I'm sure you all will be able to engage in, is the challenge of changing our economy and how we live to net zero. And for that, I'll be drawing upon the various reports to the UK government. But before I start, I would like to acknowledge this talk came about, was instigated by Ken Ward Atherton, a good friend of mine and sadly missed. So let's start with the science.
We are all aware that carbon dioxide is increasing in the atmosphere, but how much has atmospheric CO2 risen in your lifetime? Over 3 generations, this increase ranges from 12 parts per million for a child aged 9, 65 parts per million for an adult aged 34, and 95 parts per million for someone aged 59. This increase in carbon dioxide is driven by burning of fossil fuels, such as from generating electricity or from driving cars. It is also produced by changing how land is used, such as from cutting down and burning forests. We emit over the globe typically 10 petagrams of carbon every year. 10 petagrams weigh the same as 10 billion tons. A large sperm whale weighs around 50 tons. So emitting 10 petagrams of carbon weighs about the same as adding 200 million sperm whales to the sky every year. Much of the emitted carbon stays in the atmosphere, but nearly half is absorbed by the land and ocean.
So that's happened over all of our lifetimes. And so we're now at a situation, we've just passed a threshold where 1/3 of the atmospheric carbon dioxide is now due to anthropogenic effects from carbon emissions. There have been lots of assessments of the effect of that on the climate system. Now, the climate is not only affected by atmospheric carbon dioxide, it's affected by water vapor, sunspot cycles, volcanic emissions, changes in atmosphere and ocean circulation. But this effect of rising atmospheric CO2, decade by decade, is having a difference. And this has been recently encapsulated in the latest intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change report. So this involved 234 scientists from 66 countries, some of them I know, based on 14,000 scientific papers. 11 of my papers were in there. It's a huge community-wide effort, and it's been approved by 195 governments. Now, this report has given some very stark statements. For the first time, it said the scale of recent changes across the climate system are unprecedented. And it stated it's unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, the ocean, and the land. That's not to say other processes aren't going on, they are. But the rise in greenhouse gases has had a systematic effect on that system. Global temperatures have marched up. This is a nice graphic by Ed Hawkins, where the colors represent the temperature anomaly relative to an average from 1850 to 2020. Blue is cold, red is warm. And what you can see with this graphic is that the last decade or two, that's where all the red is. That's where our climate system over the globe is warmer, systematically warmer than the average. There are year-on-year variations linked with climate modes, such as El Nino, but there's a systematic signal there. Increasingly, and this is one of the new things from the IPCC report, was a statement that this greenhouse forcing is affecting the weather and climate extremes. Now, a lot of people thought that that would probably be the case, but weather is different to climate, and lots of processes can affect weather extremes. But the view is now that human-caused warming is increasing the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events around the globe. That doesn't mean to say that we can prove climate has caused a particular event, but the fact that we are increasing atmospheric CO2 is enhancing the likelihood of these extreme events and probably enhancing their amplitude, such as the flooding in Germany, the wildfires in Greece. There's a whole range of weather extremes that have happened over the last year or two, as encapsulated in news stories or various weather reports. So what is then needed? And this is the area that I've worked on. There is only one systematic way to limit human-induced global warming, and that is to limit the cumulative amount of carbon we emit. What I mean by cumulative is the sum of how much carbon we've emitted since the pre-industrial. So there's this aspiration to limit that. That's what's meant by net zero CO2 emissions. And we have to reach that along with other strong reductions in other greenhouse gases such as methane. That has to be done in order for us to limit the warming. And that's encapsulated in the Paris Climate Agreement, my second video.
The Paris Agreement, signed in 2016 by 195 countries, aspires to keep the rise in global temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius and to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, all relative to pre-industrial temperatures. To avoid exceeding these warming targets, how much carbon may we emit? From a large set of climate model projections, we find that a 2 degrees Celsius rise corresponds to an additional carbon emission of around 400 petagrams from 2017. Without further action, this 2 degrees Celsius warming is likely to occur in a couple of decades, between 2038 and 2050. We face a choice where we are all gambling with our future. The carbon choices that we all make now will affect the climate for ourselves and future generations. Taking action to further reduce carbon emissions will be very challenging, but the earlier we start, the more likely we are to avoid dangerous climate change.
So let's just explore this link between surface warming and cumulative carbon emissions. That's what's plotted in this graph. And this is the one bit of more scientific content. So on the x-axis going to the right, it's showing the increase in carbon emissions since year 1870. And in the y-axis, it's showing the warming. And the black dots are showing decadal observations. When we make projections as to what the future holds, we run climate models or Earth system models following different scenarios. those scenarios vary in detail, but the different lines, coloured lines, represent different scenarios that we might choose to follow. All of them are showing a simple result. The more carbon we emit, the warmer it will become. So this now is showing the full spread of different climate model scenarios. And so if we want to avoid a 2-degree warming, as marked by the dashed red line, then there's a band, there's a range in how much carbon we can emit. And that's what the Paris Agreement is arguing we should address. So we've gone through the science. Atmospheric CO2 has increased for all of us, and that is associated with progressive warming. The science is very clear. We can only minimize this effect by reducing CO2 emissions. So Sir Patrick Vallance, when the IPCC report came out, he said this requires action from everyone. So let's talk now about some of those different options. In fact, the UK, if we compare the millions of tons of CO2 we emit, or we can think about it in terms of sperm whales, we in 1990 emitted 800 million tons. In 2020, we're at half that level. So there has been progress made with this target. How has this been achieved? You can separate the changes into the different sectors. So the carbon resource involved in producing energy has more than halved. And that is mainly due to the success of the expansion of the renewable sector. Offshore wind has been particularly successful, as well as onshore wind and solar power. I'll return to some of the other challenges there in a couple of slides. So over this last 18 months, we've all been part of a daunting social experiment where lockdown has changed our life styles, certainly in terms of transport. So over the UK in 2020, there was a 13% decrease in the UK emissions, and that's linked to about a third decrease in transport emissions. And so, of course, that is a positive story. But the other way we can turn that around is to say, well, actually, 87% of the emissions remained, despite the fact that few people are flying, commuting to work, or traveling. That highlights how structural change and further behavioral change is needed to address and meet this challenge. Now, part of that might be dealing with the natural habitat. So there's a lot of carbon locked up in nature. So in particular, this plot is showing that peatlands and woodlands store large amounts of carbon. So preserving peatlands, growing trees, rewilding can make a positive difference. It cannot, though, be an alternative to decarbonising our economy. Even with very ambitious habitat changes, you're talking about a 9% reduction. Also, we don't want to rewild in the UK and then end up importing meat because from overseas, because that by itself isn't going to decrease the global carbon footprint. So there has to be some further behavioral change as well. So if we look at the other carbon intensive areas, there's transport, there's business, residential, and agriculture. Some of those sectors, it's been relatively flat. And that is why Patrick Vallance, in his article in the IPCC report came out, emphasized the importance of science and innovation, where we try and address the structural problems that we need to take on board in order to reduce our carbon footprint. And this is my last video, which we've done from Liverpool University to highlight the challenge that we face.
What creates the fabric of our lives? That helps us grow, work, play, travel, connect. Gives us heat, light and power. Produces the everyday products we rely on. The things that make our lives easier and better. The answer? Materials innovation. It enables the technologies that make it all possible, transforming our lives and livelihoods. But it's come at a price. Because at the heart of it are fossil fuels. The more fossil fuels we use, the more carbon we emit, the warmer it's becoming. Our climate is in crisis, and the clock is ticking. We can fix this, but we need to do things differently. Behavioral change and planting trees are part of the solution, but we also need to be discovering materials that enable new technologies, which don't use petrochemicals or fossil fuels. But for the world to reach net zero, we don't have much time left. We need to innovate faster and in ways we never thought possible. Like with COVID-19, developing vaccines within a year when the world expected they would take 10. We must create solutions 10 times faster than the current rate to reach our targets. It can be done. At the University of Liverpool, we're integrating scientific insight, machine learning and lab automation to shorten research and innovation time to fundamentally change global industry. With new materials that will enable new forms of energy use and storage, and recyclable and sustainable products. To reach net zero, now is the time to invest, research, build partnerships to turbocharge materials innovation 10 times faster.
So our view there is we've done it with COVID, a tremendous success in developing the vaccine. You know, maybe this is a sector that we can do the same in meeting net zero. So to sum up, climate change is happening. We can see more and more signatures of that. The scientific community, there's a growing consensus that these signals are robust and we understand the mechanisms leading to those responses. To meet net zero carbon is very challenging. It's a fundamental changes to our behavior, the natural habitat, and innovation. Some of this involves what happens at a national, international level in terms of energy, production and distribution, heating and food policies, how we plan our cities and the countryside, how we employ new technology. As individuals, we can make a difference. What we consume and eat, how we heat ourselves, and how we travel. Okay, thank you. I'll stop there.
Wow, thank you. So as I mentioned before, we are very lucky to also have Professor Colin Price with us today. He's a professor at the Porter School of the Environment and Earth Sciences at Tel Aviv University, and he's the head of the Department of Environmental Studies. He was born in Johannesburg, South Africa, and after starting his university studies there, he transferred to Tel Aviv University in 1982, where he completed his bachelor's and master's in science degrees in geophysics and atmospheric sciences. He received his PhD at Columbia University in New York in 1993 while working at NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies in New York as well. Professor Price, we'd love you to speak.
Hi, thanks. Thank you very much, Joe, for this very late invitation. Just a few days ago, I was asked to come, so I haven't prepared any speeches or any presentations, but Rick gave a really good introduction to the problems we're facing today with climate change, the climate crisis. And I agree 100% with him. We are the problem, but we can also be the solution. And at Tel Aviv University, we've just established now a Climate Action Center, which is trying to do that. We're trying to look for solutions to the problem. Whenever we have a problem, instead of calling it a problem, we call it a challenge. And whenever we have challenges, we look for the opportunity when you have challenges. And I think there are many opportunities here, especially for Israel. And Rick mentioned some of them when it's alternative energies, new materials, innovation. And so maybe starting on the innovation side, everyone talks about the startup nation in Israel, and we have a huge amount of startup companies in all different fields, but we see an ever increasing number of startups in the field of environment and more particularly climate change. At Tel Aviv University in the Porter School, we actually have an accelerator for startup companies from outside of the university to get them going and to accelerate this field. And it's amazing the ideas that some of them have. I can just mention two companies which are related to looking for solutions. As Rick mentioned, one of the big problems is agriculture and our diets and what we're eating. And one of the biggest problems when it comes to diet is beef. Not only do cows, are cows, something like 60% of the mammals on the planet are cows. And that's because we want our hamburgers, we want our steaks. And not only do they emit huge amounts of methane, but they use huge amounts of water and land, and we have to grow lots of food for them to eat. Well, in Israel, there's a new startup company called Aleph Farms, which is actually growing steaks in the lab. So they're taking basically stem cells or cells from cows, and from that you can grow a complete steak with the bone and everything. And they've now just recently 3D printed a steak. It tastes exactly like your regular steak. You can't tell the difference. It's real meat, but no cow was killed to produce that. And if this can be scaled up in the future, then we can think of getting rid of all these farms with cattle, which are impacting the climate, to save the land areas, reduce the amount of grain we have to grow for them, obviously reduce methane, and can have a big impact on the climate. Another company is looking at trying to capture the carbon dioxide. We heard about net zero, which is to get to basically a balance between what's going up into the atmosphere, what we're emitting, and what's coming back down. Some of that's naturally through growing trees, and the oceans absorb some carbon dioxide, but we have to accelerate that process. So there's something called carbon capture and sequestration, where you actually suck that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and then convert it either to liquid, and you can think of it as like soda water, pump it into the ground where you actually had the natural gas and oil before, and this actually will then become a simple chalkstone and limestone, and will turn into rock. Will be there for thousands, if not millions of years. But this is very, very expensive at the moment. It's about 1,000 euros per ton of carbon dioxide. And a new startup company in Israel is thinking or of using balloons in the upper atmosphere to do the same kind of process using also solar energy, because this is heavy in energy. And they claim they can do it for 40 euros for every ton of carbon dioxide. So if we can scale this up to a huge amount of maybe balloons sucking out the carbon dioxide, this can also have a big impact. And so startup companies are really getting involved in this in Israel. And even though Israel is a very small country, we think we can have a big impact on the solutions and around the globe. Going back to the climate center we have, similar to Rick, I've been working for the last 30 years on climate science and trying to understand the climate system and trying to predict what may happen in the future. But I came to realize that if I invest another 30 years in research, I'll just know a little bit better how bad it's going to be in the future, how hot it's going to be, how intense the storms are going to be. And so I think the scientists, and me in particular, we need to make a switch, and we have to realize that we can continue doing our research in our labs with students, but we also have to be part of the solution. We have to try to figure out ways to solve this problem. This is, I think, the biggest problem humanity is facing, and it's going to be a big problem for our children, for our grandchildren, and therefore we have to start today. And as one of the movies said, the sooner we start, the easier it's going to be. If we wait another 10 years, it's going to be even more difficult to deal with this problem. And so we're starting to look at these different aspects of how we can contribute here in Israel to some of these solutions. And I'll just give one example, because I don't want to take up too much time. And that's related to this region of the world, the Middle East, which is always a hotbed for conflict and other issues. But we also know that the Middle East is basically where all the oil comes from. And many of the conflicts in the Middle East have been over oil. And maybe people can try to imagine what the world would be like if we didn't rely on oil anymore, if everything went to solar. And our neighbors around Israel, some are more friendly than others, have lots and lots of sun, including Israel. They also have lots of area to build solar farms. And so one of the ideas we're playing with is we can use the climate crisis as an opportunity also for regional stability. Maybe we can work together with Jordan, with Egypt, to build the solar farms, the huge solar farms in their countries, supply them with jobs, factories, and help their economies. And Israel can actually buy the energy from them. We can set up the transmission lines, the batteries which may be needed to store this in the evening, in the nighttime when there's no sun. And Israel can actually then buy this electricity, and then we have a dual relationship between our neighbors and Israel. Both sides need this. One side may need the electricity to produce water, the other electricity for the economy. And the climate crisis can actually be used maybe as an opportunity to promote stability, peace in the region, and try to think what the world would be like if we didn't really rely on oil anymore. Plenty of here in the Middle East. So I'll stop there. And if there are any questions, we'd be happy to take, I think.
Yes, just thank you very much. And just as a reminder, if you want to ask any questions, we encourage you to have your cameras on. Just click on the raise hand button. And if you don't know where it is, it's just at the bottom of the participants list. So ask away. The first question is from Margaret.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. It's her husband, Jeffrey. I wondered, it was mentioned at the beginning that there were other factors that are possible, volcanic emissions, sunspots, and so on. Are scientists, do you know, able to quantify and integrate the issue, the matter of carbon emissions into these other factors, so that we can get some idea of the proportion involved? Because is it possible, I'm asking, that we're actually dealing with something which is part of Earth's natural life cycle, about which at the end of the day we can possibly do nothing about, because the Earth has warmed and got colder over its long history in different ages? Just in London here, our Thames used to freeze in the, I can't remember when, but somebody will know, mid-19th century. And the second factor is that I would be personally far more accepting of the impositions that are about to be made on us if there was scientists were advocating a strong program of population control, which somebody mentioned the 1870s. It's gone up now to 9 billion upon the Earth. And it seems to me that if getting carbon neutral is a real issue, population control should be a concomitant objective. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that question. If I can, just sharing a slide that I had. So firstly, there are many different factors that affect our climate system. And there are, of course, long-term processes which are leading to different changes. There are glacial, interglacial cycles operating on anything from 20,000 to 100,000 years. There are volcanic emissions, but in particular, there's the solar irradiance. And so there was a period where people thought that the solar irradiance was actually leading to the recent warming. But that this is a plot from NASA. The yellow line is showing the solar irradiance. The red is showing the global warming. And the recent warming that we've seen over the last 50 years does not match that explanation. Now, the more rigorous test is that when you construct a climate model, you can choose what forcing to include in there. So you can run a model without this effect or with this effect. Now, the only way that places like the UK Met Office or other weather centres can explain the warming that we've seen over the last 30 years is if they include the increase in the greenhouse gases. There is no other alternative to that. So the short answer is yes, there are lots of other processes going on and have been very important for the Earth's history. In terms of the recent warming that we're seeing over the last 50 years, the only credible explanation is the rise in atmospheric CO2 and the other greenhouse gases. Now, your second question about population, undeniably that population growth and the demand for carbon that entails is another aspect of the problem. I'm sure the other IPCC reports will be reporting on that as well. The one that's came out is talking about the physical drivers. And so we're just dealing with the integrated demand for carbon. Now, whether that's from many people or few people, that's a secondary, kind of a social sciences debate. Colin, anything you'd want to add?
Yeah, I'll add a few words there. First of all, about the volcanoes. So some people, volcanic activities increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Well, luckily, we've had a few huge volcanic explosions in the last 50 years. The last big one was Pinatubo in 1991. Before that, in 1982, there was El Chichon, huge explosions with a lot of particles in the atmosphere. But if you look at the trends or the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we saw it in one of Rick's slides or one of his movies, you cannot see any trace of those volcanic eruptions. So it's really below the detection level. There's no change in carbon dioxide from volcanoes. They're very small contribution relative to country. So that we can check, and we have checked it, and there's no evidence at all that volcanoes are causing any increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. As we heard from the sun, we saw that the sun, people have been claiming this is one of the factors. So the sun definitely does have an impact on the Earth's climate. Obviously, that causes the sun, heating of us, the winter. But at least from our experience, we also saw from there's no way you can explain the warming by natural causes. The only explain what's happened in the last 70 years is through man-made greenhouse gases increasing the atmosphere. Ice ages, we know the ice ages, we've had warmer periods in the past, it's been up and down and ice sheets, and we understand this. We think this is related to the Earth changes around the sun, which is just off the charts. If you look at the data, the amount of greenhouse gases in the last million years, even million years, new IPCC concentrations are the highest they've been for at least 2 million years. And while the temperatures may have been higher, they changed on a very slow rate. What's key, what's happening today is the rate of warming. We have never seen such a rapid warming of the Earth since we collected data. So for millions of years, we haven't seen such a rate. So something definitely is different now to what happened during the ice ages, and all the scientists working on this say that this cannot be from natural causes. Finally, about the population, just to say about the population, that most of the growth in greenhouse gases is due to the population in the Western world, which has basically stopped now. Most of the growth is now in Africa and Asia, where they don't really use much energy. But that will be a problem in the future if they do follow the same track that we did by using fossil fuels. And hence, we need to actually move those countries, the developing world, more to solar energy, renewable energies. Otherwise, you really will have a problem.
Brian, just to let you know, your internet's a little bit patchy. I don't know if you've got like to move the camera somewhere.
Sorry.
That's all right, no problem. So I'd like to ask a question if you guys are okay with that. Today has been there have been quite a few protests in London. As I was driving home, I had heard about. I don't know, Colin, if you've heard of. There has been an offshoot of Extinction Rebellion called Insulate Britain. They tend to these groups tend to do some like shock tactics in order to create a big, like, I don't know, like, I wouldn't want to call it a protest, but it's disruption. And I just wonder whether or not you think that this kind of action creates more problems for you guys to actually get the message across, because whether or not it actually drives people's skepticism of what's going on, and whether or not it's more hindrance than help.
Okay, I'll start. In many ways, I've been working in scientific research for the last 30 years, and probably the last 20 years, the essence of the IPCC reports have been relatively clear that the planet is warming. We've gained in confidence with that scientific support. But in many ways, there's been a broad consensus in the science for much of that time. The fact that we've had school protests about climate change, that has suddenly lifted the profile of this problem. And in many ways, for me, it's puzzling. The scientific arguments, the essence of what I've said, I could have said 20 years ago. I wouldn't have had as much supporting information, and I wouldn't have been able to address some of the concerns and eliminate other contenders. But the essence of the science has been there for a long time. So really, if there's going to be political change, if this problem is going to be solved, it is going to have to be pressure from the public, which is going to have to lead to action, and for governments to react to that action. So that's then a separate issue about how effective it is if you want to drive home and there's been a protest which stops you driving on the M25, or you want to go on a tube and someone's lying on the roof. But it's certainly the case that raising the profile of this has been absolutely essential to making this a feasible thing for government to put resource into.
Yeah, I think that basically we do need to have some bottom-up influence on the leaders. The leaders normally listen somewhat. Hopefully they'll listen to the public and the voters. And as Rick said, over the last 20, 30 years, we've been basically saying the same message. But now I think climate change is in the face of everyone. We see the floods in Europe, we see the fires all over Europe. So people are really aware, and maybe also things are more available through the internet, on Facebook, for the younger generation, and it's going to be their lives which are going to be the biggest impact on their lives in the future. But the actual methodology of how you protest and what you do, then I think it's debatable how you get your message across. And I'm not so supportive of the scare tactics, because when you scare people that this is the end of the world's coming, and then people have a knee-jerk reaction to not do anything. Well, it's kind of, what can we do? And I think we really need to talk again about the opportunities, that here we have a real opportunity of changing our economies to cleaner economies, new jobs, more jobs, cleaner air. Less people will die when we have less air pollution. And so I think there are a lot of positive things that can be done. And so the way the messages get across, I suppose, is debatable amongst all of us.
Thank you very much. It's a great answer. The next question is from Anwar Farouk. Anwar?
Yeah, good evening, sir. This is Anwar from London. And today's talk is very, very appropriate, and it's very helpful for our understanding and some action points. Only thing is, just like the COVID, in COVID situation, lot of governments took help of the scientists and professors and all such a rational way to reduce the effects of COVID. Now, of course, it cannot be like, as Colin said, it cannot be panic creation. But at the same time, this is also very, very important aspect, and we need to do something by awareness programs, lot of world awareness programs about the environment and the destiny of our Earth atmosphere, weather, and habitat, and all these things. And for practical nature, I would like to have some list of do's and don'ts for better environment, better the carbon emission zero target, and what are the things we can do on a ground level, not a very high big level, like cycling or walking or reducing air travel and public transportation. So some practical advice, like a list of do's and don'ts basing on the current research reports, so that it will be very helpful for the common people. Otherwise, many times the scientists itself, they themselves, they will not be able to say, I cannot say, because the scientists, a lot of information is showing that way, and some information is showing this way, what we can. So if the scientists themselves, they cannot tell exactly what the people have to do, sometimes it will be giving some confusion. So instead of that, basing on the data, statistical data or whatever, if you can, if you means the scientific community can just tell, okay, these are the minimum do's and don'ts, and these are better practices, that will be very helpful, and that will also be added as a awareness program, like social awareness. This is environmental awareness program, so that everybody will be aware. And like smoking is almost prohibited in some places, anti-environment practices also must be prohibited. Slowly, we should go towards that, so that everybody will be responsible for our own Mother Earth environment, because this Mother Earth is the unique mother of all the living beings here, and we should make aware all the people that everybody's responsibility. It's not one person's responsibility, every country's responsibility to just have a good, nice environment for all the human beings to live little more longer, because Earth as a whole, Earth life also might be very limited because of so much misuse of resources and other problems. That is what I suggest, a little bit of practical do's and don'ts and good practices. Thank you, sir.
Do you want to go first this time, Colin?
Okay, so I understand you're interested in knowing some personal list of things that you could do personally to help the environment and to deal with climate change, not on the, say, governmental level, just for the personal person. So basically, there are many things that an individual can do, even small things. And if we talk generally about energy, so things like turning off the light when you leave your room, don't leave the lights on all the time, hanging up your washing to dry by the sun instead of using your dryer. All of these things will save energy in the long term. When you go to the supermarket and you buy your food, anything which is in a wrapper or which has been frozen used energy and was transported there. If you go to the farmer's market and you buy fresh vegetables and fruit, you're saving energy because you don't have to ship that and you don't have to freeze it. If you shop online, that also, some people, this is a big problem with the younger generation, especially in Israel, that they're buying from Alibaba in China because it's so cheap, but they don't realize that you have to ship that from China to Israel, and they wrap it up and it's put on a plane. All of this is using energy, and if you can buy locally, then you're going to be saving that energy. I think the most productive way is to what we're doing tonight, and it's the cheapest. Talk to your friends, talk to your family, spread the word that there's a problem. And maybe the most important thing, when it's election time, vote for people who are going to do something about keeping the environment and dealing with the climate crisis. Rick? You're mute.
Yeah, I think it's about food, eating food locally produced. It is about reducing meat consumption, as Colin was previously talking about. Ultimately, it will be on choices of how we heat our homes. That technology isn't probably that affordable right now, but ultimately we need to be moving towards heat pumps in the UK rather than gas-fired boilers. How we choose to travel is important. So they're the three individual things, but I do want to just share one further slide. This is what we did in the 1980s. We banned the production of CFCs. That has led to a reduction in the ozone hole, and that was the purpose of it, the Montreal Protocol. But that worldwide action has, because CFCs are also greenhouse gases, that avoided 0.8 of a degree warming. That's enormous. Any chance of us avoiding 1.5 or 2 degrees warming, we would have had no chance of doing that if there hadn't been action in the 1980s in banning CFCs. Great. So the individual actions are important and can make it, but coordinated actions are even more important.
Our last question is from Sylvia.
Yeah, with respect to the other gentleman who was saying about we change our ways, we change our habits and things like that. I live in a rural community and we're not smoke free. And yet you go to the cities, you go to Manchester, Manchester's been smoke free since the 1970s, and the difference in the, you know, I'm agreeing with what you're saying, the difference in the atmosphere and things like that. But, you know, you come to the rural communities and it's mainly private homes, so you cannot enforce that they go to an alternative fuel. And then because we live in a rural region, which is a holiday region as well, so we're getting a lot more people having holidays here now than we were very overrun with visitors. But, you know, they're also using fossil fuels to heat their holiday homes. And, you know, people come camping and they light fires in the environment and things. It's not just that, you know, if you live in a city, you know, you can reduce the use of cars because you've got the bus services, you've got the infrastructure. But if you live in a rural community, we don't have that infrastructure. And then when it comes to housing and rebuilding housing, I live in Wales, so we've had over £1 billion put into building new homes. Our housing associations have established a factory to build homes that are carbon neutral, and they're built in the factory and then they're built on site. These are passive homes, if you've heard of passive homes and that. But social housing is only 16% of the housing in Wales. We've got 1,300,000 homes and only 16% are social housing. And the money is only being spent into the social housing, which isn't having an impact. So we're having an impact on small groups in society, not on everybody. And so, and I agree, eat less meat and things like that, but we're a farming community. So if you take away our farming, what have we got? How do we live?
Rick, I'll leave that for you. This is more local issue, I think.
If we are, you know, we've progressively warmed up the planet. If we carry on as we are, without paying any of these prices and taking on board, the planet is going to get warmer. So it's a question of, what do you want to leave to the next generations? Do you want to just protect every interest of every person and carry on as we are? Because the answer, I can tell you now, is it's going to be a warmer planet. There's going to be greater melting of the ice, greater sea levels. There's going to be more pressure on our environment in terms of lack of ecosystem diversity. So something has got to change. And I'm not saying I have all the answers, and I'm not saying it's not going to be hard on certain communities, but there has to be fundamental change. And the idea that we can move ahead without having to make sacrifices is naive. We will have to make sacrifices, and there will have to be changes in lifestyle if we are to hope to pass on a more sustainable state for the planet. The idea that we can just carry on as we are right now without any changes isn't sustainable. So it's a choice we all have.
I'd just like to say that we need to also look at all of these crises. If we also look at the corona crisis, is a risk management issue. What are we prepared to do to prevent the risks, which we don't really know what they are in the future? But when we have to wear masks and we have to shut down because there's a virus around us, people have to give up certain things for the good of the whole. And the same with the climate crisis. There's a lot of similarities. It's just a longer time scale. If we don't do something now, we don't change our ways, things are going to get really bad pretty quickly, and then it may be too late to fix them. So we need to say whether it's worth doing X, Y, Z now to prevent those in the future, or just wait and see what happens. I think scientists are saying today that we can't wait and see what happens because it'll be too late and then we can't go back in time.
So we've got one more question, if you guys have the time, from Shane Masterson.
Thank you, Joe. It's really good to see Colin collaborating tonight on this with Rick Williams. I think that says something about the position we are now, where present evolution in space exploration can inform and inspire us about change on the planet. Can I just have a brief comment from both of you on that?
Well, if I called it, you know, I think this is a case where the international community, certainly the scientific community, are very aligned. And so, you know, the IPCC report was endorsed by 195 governments involving scientists across the world by design because of the challenges we face. I think in many ways, Israel and Britain are in a similar situation in that we are countries which can come up with some of the solutions. So many ways what Colin is talking about is replicated by some of the themes that we're addressing at Liverpool University. So I think we've got shared aspirations, even if we happen to live in a different part of the globe.
I wasn't sure about the reference to the space industry. Shane, maybe you want to clarify that? You're muted. Shane?
Rick, yes, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? For example, Rick, described predicting there and how that fed into our awareness of the need for structural and behavioral change. We're also witnessing, a new horizon of challenges in terms of space exploration, a phase of technological and societal evolution we're at now. Do you think that that is actually going to provide the sort of motivation? Joe asked a very good question there about certain types of activism being a bit off center and a bit inappropriate and challenging in itself. I think it's very interesting that Colin participates tonight in this discussion because it shows something about the interdisciplinary advantages which we can see now in the current phase of space exploration, and how that feeds back on our awareness of this planet.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a whole nother topic because I'm also involved in what's called new space now, which is the new revolution occurring in space for using nano satellites, cube satellites, and Elon Musk and Planet Labs. And so there's also a huge revolution going on there, driven by economics, maybe supplying internet from space. And I think with climate change, we're only going to find the solutions when it again becomes economical for the startup companies and for businesses. And they realize that not only can they impact the environment positively, but they can also make some money. And it's not the end of the world if they make some money and solve the climate crisis. So I think there has to be some massive investment and incentives for businesses, for startup companies, for governments to invest in new technologies. And things can be dealt with. If companies are going to make money along the way, that's what's going to bring them quicker to the playing field and find the solutions.
Guys, thank you very, very much. It's been really enlightening. I'm going to ask to call on Joy Wolf to close our event. But first, I want to just remind everyone that coming soon is Israel Bond's £36 bond. And if you want to purchase bonds for Tel Aviv University, for the British Israel Chamber of Commerce, for Liverpool University, we'd be very, very happy to help and get that done. And if you want to join our mailing list for any of our future events, just drop me an email and let me know. So Joy, please take it away.
Thank you very much. A quick thank you to Joe for facilitating tonight. And I would like to just associate myself with the recognition of Gideon Klaus and what he's done for the Chamber. I feel very privileged to have been asked to give this vote of thanks. We were promised in the publicity two renowned experts on global action. And from two different points of view, we have certainly, I think, delivered on that, because it's been a very easy presentation for a layperson like me to understand and follow, even though a lot of statistics, but it's certainly been something very encouraging, and there's some messages to take away. Professor Rick Williams, you gave us some quite important facts about 195 countries signing up for this. I just hope they're delivering. There's so much conflicting information about what we ought to be doing, but you've clarified that very nicely tonight. One of the facts you gave us was that we'll be halfway to our objective by 2050. And to a lay person like me, who's not at all techie, that seems nowhere near enough. And you followed that up with your last slide, in which you emphasized that and said, and both of you, both you and Professor Price, talked about the clock is ticking. And I think you have shown us very, very clearly tonight just how the clock is ticking and how much we have to get involved in helping in our small way. But what I'd like to say is that, apart from thanking you for tonight's presentation, which has been fascinating, I would like to thank you for what you are doing and to ask you to continue in this vein. I was particularly pleased, as most people know, I'm very involved with Israel, and I was particularly pleased to hear from Professor Price what Israel is doing here. Israel has a reputation for research and finding solutions, and I hope as you continue that work, Professor Price, that Israel will be able to perhaps lead the way and help us through all of this. But I think the final message is the message that you gave us, which is that we have to get the message out. And I think that's one of the current failings. And certainly you tonight have helped us with some of the answers. And if everybody who goes away from this listens to what we've been told and what we've been asked to do, getting the message out, if everybody has a go in their small way. I'm a very elderly grandma of my grandchildren range in age from 35 to 10. I'm worried for the future of my grandchildren, and I think most people are. And what you are doing and what you're helping us through and the information you've given us, please carry on the good work. It's so important, and we have been very blessed tonight to listen to both of you, the information you've given us and the encouragement. So thank you both very, very much indeed. It's been a remarkable, remarkable presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joy.
Thank you all. Thank you very much, and good night.